The icy moon hung in the blackness like a shard of frozen glass, its surface glinting under the thin light of a distant star that gave more glare than warmth. Kieran sat in the drop seat with his knees braced and his hands steady on the webbing. The shuttle rattled as it knifed through high-altitude crystals, each impact like a handful of nails thrown at the hull. Across from him, a quartet of alien cadets watched him with the bored cruelty of students who believed the test had ended before it began. A Vrathi with translucent quills rolled his shoulders and smiled without mirth. An Auran medic polished the lenses on a mask that would fog the moment genuine cold hit it. Two Ilex siblings in matte armor compared stats on their wrist sets and pretended not to glance at the human with the wool scarf tucked under his collar. Kieran met each look and let the shuttle's vibration drum calm through his bones. He could already feel the air temperature dropping with every 100 meters the pilot bled from altitude. The mission brief had been simple in the way dangerous things can be simple. Survive 48 hours with what the instructors allowed the team to carry and what the land allowed the team to take. Remote pickup would return at noon mark, local cycle, 2 days from now. No contact with base, no distress calls unless a limb came off or a heartbeat flatlined. The instructor's commentary channel had been switched off the moment the shuttle undocked, but mouths still worked. "Delicate mammal will go down first," the Vrathi announced, voice buzzing through quill throat like an electric wasp. "Sweat glands are useless at -80. One Ilex sibling, the taller one with a scar over the jaw hinge, smirked and tapped a line on a slate. "Statistical survival models agree. Human range ends before ours does. He becomes ballast by third dusk." The medic pretended neutrality and failed. "I will not let his death reflect on our cohort score." Kieran kept his face blank and breathed through the tart chemical scent of the shuttle's scrubbers. He pictured a kitchen window fogged by a pot of stew, a cracked enamel kettle hissing, a woman's hands cupping his fingers and turning his palms toward a candle flame to show him where heat ends and burns begin. He did not argue about glands or models. He had done that kind of arguing when he was younger, and it had won him nothing but sore pride. The pilot's voice dropped from the ceiling like frost. "Surface in 30. Wind shear high. Brace." The shuttle kicked, bucked, and then settled with a grinding hiss onto a plain that looked like a frozen sea hammered flat by giants. Through the porthole, Kieran saw a sky the color of burned bone and small clouds of particles scudding sideways as if whipped by an invisible broom. The temperature readout on the ramp console lurched down 2 ticks as the door cracked. Breaths sharpened. Words turned to smoke. The ramp slammed into the ice with a brittle bark, and the first knife of wind slid under every collar. The group moved out, heads down, packs tight, the Vrathi taking point because claws held better on ice and pride held better than claws. The instructor who had briefed them, a broad-shouldered human with frost-bitten ears from some old misjudgment, had pointed at a distant ridge on the map and said, "Your shelter is anywhere that is not the wind's first choice." That was the whole lesson, wrapped in a neat sentence that would not save anyone who believed gear could outvote physics. The team walked until boots found sastrugi, wind-carved ridges that meant slower ground but better reading of direction, and then cut a line that kept the ridge to the shoulder and the star at the eye's edge. The moon's horizon was so close it felt like a lid. Sound carried too far and not far enough. Every scrape echoed inside the head. Every shout went flat in the open air. After an hour, the Ilex siblings started to quarrel over the GPS, which jittered from the magnetic tide that pulsed under the crust. The medic called for a rest that no one wanted but everyone took. Kieran knelt, unhooked a strap, and pulled a small roll of actual wool from the side pocket of his pack. He slid it under his flight jacket and around his core, tucking it down as if he had done that motion 100 times because he had. The Vrathi stared and blinked one nictitating membrane. "Primitive insulation," the Vrathi sneered. "Cute." "Quiet," the taller Ilex snapped. "Save breath." Kieran said nothing. He moved forward through the cold the way he had been taught to move through long arguments and long winters, by measuring what mattered. The air cut clean. The wind gusted and then crouched. He watched the snow's surface for low swales that promised a lee, for a drift that had risen from a hollow, for any hint of a fold. He listened for the whistle that meant a lip, and the thump that meant a cornice would break under an incautious step. He took the measure of each teammate in the corners of his eyes. The medic's fingers had gone stiff from overhandling instruments without mitts. The Vrathi's quills were rhymed, which meant even a creature built for cold could misjudge a wet wind. The Ilex siblings hid fatigue behind snide as if mockery were a thermal layer. Kieran tasted metal and salt at the back of his tongue as his breath froze the air around his scarf and thawed it again with each exhale. He smiled under the cloth because that was a good sign. Frost that builds and melts in rhythm means the body is cycling heat, not hoarding it. 2 more hours brought them to a shallow bowl with a low ridge on the windward side and a scatter of dark stones that looked like punctuation in a white sentence. The Vrathi raised a fist, and the team stopped. "Here," the Vrathi announced. "Cut blocks. Build wall. Standard field igloo. Version 12. The Ilex siblings unpacked a fold saw and began carving rectangles from drift crust. The medic unpacked the heater pods with reverent fingers, treating each unit like a charm against a curse. Kieran set his pack down and ran a gloved hand along the underside of the ridge where loose snow had gathered. He could feel with his knuckles how the wind had scoured the far side and dropped its burden here, building a bank that would not bear weight, but would hold a form for long enough. He had built shapes like this with his grandmother when he was small, on hills that felt as endless as this plain felt now. She had said the same thing the instructor had said in different words. "The wind will do half the work for you if you stop telling it what to do." He took a small shovel and began to carve a trench low and narrow, deep enough to lie in, no wider than a shoulder's spread, with a lip at the top to hold a lid. One Ilex sibling peered over and snorted. "Grave size. Appropriate." Kieran kept scraping, kept breathing, kept counting motions. He cut a shelf at one end just big enough for a cup and a small flame. He punched a vent with the handle and angled it away from the prevailing gusts. He pushed a sheet of emergency fabric over the trench and weighted it with ice blocks, not high like a tent, but flat like a lid. He checked the far edge and shored it with one more block. He ran a gloved thumb around the vent and felt for draw. The medic fired the first heater pod under a translucent dome of polymer. For 10 seconds, a soft orange glow made everyone's shoulders loosen. On the 11th second, the glow stuttered and went black. The medic stared at the unit as if staring could make electrons reverse. The second pod lit and died the same way. The Vrathi cursed in a language that sounded like knives pulled from wet cloth. The Ilex siblings went quiet in the way people go quiet when a plan falls apart inside a chest. The magnetometer on the taller sibling's wrist flashed an angry curve and then showed a blank line. Kieran leaned on the shovel and let the cold press against his cheeks. He knew this feeling. He had known it as a boy when an old truck had coughed once on a ridge road and then given up the ghost in a gust that could roll a careless body into a culvert. He had known it as a trainee when a climate-controlled suit had fogged and blurred and the instructor had told him to remove the helmet to prove he trusted his lungs. He took a breath and tasted grit. He closed the lid on the trench. He crawled in and turned onto his side to test the space with shoulder and hip. The fabric flexed and held. Air moved where it should. He crawled out, ignoring the way the Vrathi's quills rattled. He walked to a scatter of meal tins, opened one, and slid the empty can into his pocket. The medic watched with helpless fury. "What are you doing?" "Making something that won't short," Kieran said, voice calm. He did not explain more because explanations burn fuel, and heat is fuel, and calm is heat. He latched the can under his arm and began to gather small things the wind had not stripped from the world. Dry moss frozen in a crust the size of a palm, a strip of cloth from packaging torn to a finger-wide ribbon, a smear of ration fat that clung to the lid of a tin after the Ilex siblings had scooped the last edible scrap. He worked with slow hands so clumsy anger would not get invited into the motion. He punched small air holes around the rim with the awl on his multi-tool, turning the can as the wind tried to take it. He braided the cloth with a twist of moss to make a wick thicker than a thread and thinner than a rope. He pressed the wick into the can, smeared fat down its length, and set the can on the shelf he had carved inside the trench. He struck sparks with the tool that pilots called obsolete, and his grandmother had called the only honest friend a pocket ever carried. The wick caught, guttered, and then settled into a small, steady flame that made a circle of air above it wobble. Heat began to gather, not a blaze, not a boast, but a presence. He watched to make sure the vent drew and the flame did not steal the breath a body would need. He slid in, pulled the lid down, and waited with one hand near the vent and one hand near the can. He counted to 60 twice. He felt warmth press against his knuckles. He felt the air stay smooth in his throat. He eased out and left the lid half set to let the space temper. The Vrathi had stopped sneering. The Ilex siblings had stopped pretending indifference. The medic's eyes had a gleam that looked like a thawing lake. "Show me," the medic said, voice thin with cold and pride. Kieran nodded once and showed hands, not words. He demonstrated the twist of the wick, the hole pattern for draw, the way to seat the can so it could not tip and turn a shelter into a coffin. He told the medic to carve the trench lower, to think in terms of a body's volume, not a room's volume. He told the Ilex siblings to stop building a palace for cold and start building a pocket for heat. He told the Vrathi that claws could cut good vents if claws worked with knuckles instead of against them. The wind moaned across the ridge and then laughed and then went low again. The star sank behind a veil of blown crystals that turned light into a smear. Kieran felt the shift that meant night would land like a hammer, and he moved faster without letting the motion look fast. He checked his can, trimmed the wick with a pinch, and watched the flame's heart steady. He laid the wool back around his core and pulled his jacket tight. He set the scarf at the bridge of his nose the way his grandmother had done with mittened hands that smelled of wood smoke and lanolin. He remembered her voice, patient and amused, telling him that high-tech is just another word for a thing that does not know the land yet. He did not know this moon yet, but he knew the habits of cold, and cold has fewer dialects than pride. The first shiver of true dark slid over the bowl. The medic's second shelter lid settled. One Ilex sibling cursed softly as a lid collapsed and then rebuilt it lower on the second try because instruction had finally sunk through armor. The Vrathi crouched over a can of his own, claws delicate, quills trembling, old instincts arguing with new humility. Kieran checked his trench one last time and looked at the sky that had gone from burned bone to iron. The cold brushed his cheek and seemed to taste him back. He lifted the lid, slid into the narrow warmth, and closed the world over his head. The flame whispered. The vent breathed. His breath stopped smoking. Fingers that had begun to stiffen loosened around the shovel handle. He lay on his side with knees pulled a little toward his chest to expose as little surface to the air as possible. He listened to the wind pull at the lid like a thief who does not quite dare enter. He waited for his heartbeat to slow from the long walk's drum to the shelter's metronome. He did not think about the bet he had heard whispered by instructors in a corridor, or about the line the taller Ilex had drawn on a slate. He thought about a kitchen candle flickering in a chipped can, while outside a storm filled the lane and erased footprints. He thought about hands guiding his hands, about breath shown to flame, about the line between enough heat and too much. He thought about the simple math that had carried him across a dozen hostile fields. The smaller the space, the easier to warm, the steadier the flame, the less fuel it demands, the calmer the body, the fewer mistakes it invites. The wind howled as if insulted that any creature would refuse an invitation to freeze. He smiled in the dark where no one would see and let the old trick work. Outside, the bowl became a chorus of small lights under low lids, each one a refusal, Each one a story flame tells when machines go quiet. The first night on the ice had begun, and Kieran was not the weakest link in anything. He was a human with a can and a flame and a memory, and on that moon those three things were stronger than predictions. Night pressed down until the lid of the trench felt like the underside of a frozen lake, and the flame's whisper became the only voice that mattered. Kieran lay with his knees tucked and his forearm bent beneath his cheek, counting his breaths the way his grandmother had taught him to count when clocks stopped making sense. He kept one hand near the vent to feel the draw, and one hand near the can to feel the tiny pool of heat that gathered around metal and radiated into the hollow he had carved. The cold outside spoke in knocks and rattles, testing every seam. When the wind shifted, the lid tugged and settled again with a noise like fabric remembering a promise. He let the sounds write a map in his head so he could tell which gusts were gusts and which were warnings. Somewhere to his left, a lid slumped, scraped, and rose again. The medic had cut that shelter low on the second try, but new hands always underestimated how hard wind insists. He waited for the second sound that would mean collapse. It did not come. He breathed out slowly and watched nothing, because watching flame too closely makes a person greedy for reassurance. Greed invites mistakes. The heat lifted the edge off the air so that it cut less and worked more. When he wiggled his toes inside his boots, he felt pins and needles instead of the empty ringing that means danger. He flexed his fingers once, twice, and stopped before warmth could turn to sweat. Sweat was a trap door under any cold plan. He let thought thin until sensation filled the trench with a different kind of attention, an old kind that did not need numbers. He had almost drifted into the steady half-sleep that endurance demands when the wind changed its argument and threw a handful of needles into the vent. The flame hiccuped and then steadied. He lifted the lid a finger width, cleared the vent with 2 quick scrapes, and settled the fabric with a palm pressed flat. He counted again for a full minute, then 2, and only then allowed his eyes to close. He left the lace of wakefulness tied loosely, ready to pull. A noise pulled it tight. It was not wind. It was a voice that did not want to be a voice. Kieran. The word crawled under the lid, thin and wrong in shape, frayed by cold and effort. He slid the cover back an inch, moved the scarf from his mouth, and put his ear to the seam. "Here," he said. The medic's answer shivered. "Out," she said. "Please." He damped the flame with 2 fingers pinched above the wick to cut the draw and slid out into a night that ate sound as fast as sound could be made. The stars above the bowl had become knives. The medic crouched by a trench with her hands tucked under her arms and her mask askew so that frost had formed a white mustache around her mouth. Her eyes were too wide, and the lids blinked without rhythm. He knelt and lifted the lid. The can inside sat upright, cold and dark. Soot smudged one side of the vent. The trench itself was good. The failure sat in the small things. He made his voice slow and ordinary so that panic would not hear its name and sprint. "You starved it," he said. "The lid sealed and the vent crusted. No air in, no heat out." She nodded once and then again as if the motion could wake blood. He loosened the vent with a glove, scraped the frost from its rim, and showed her how to leave a thin wedge under the lid at the lee edge so that the pressure difference would pull in a trickle and not a rush. He twisted the wick, trimmed the char, and struck the tool. The flame caught on the second try. He waited, palm above the can, counting silently to 20 so that impulse could not make him close the lid too soon. When the air breathed, he lowered the fabric and set a slap of ice against one corner to pin it. He took her hands and tucked them into his armpits, holding them there without apology until he felt joints move without hitch. Her breath steadied. Her eyes came back. "You saved me," she said in a voice the wind did not like. "We saved fuel," he said. "Go in. Do not watch the flame. Watch your breath. If you can read a sentence in your head without losing a word to shivering, you are fine. If the sentence breaks, call me." She nodded and slid in, a careful copy of calm. He listened until the lid settled and the small flame sound returned. A hard green pulse crawled across the sky from horizon to horizon and cracked the night into a dozen sheets like ice under a thrown rock. The magnetic flare the briefing had mentioned finally arrived. His wrist chrono died as if a hand had pinched a vein. Far off, the taller Ilex cursed softly, and the sound of a slate being tapped became the sound of an object being put away because the object had become superstition. The Vrathi made a noise that might have been a laugh or a rejection of the need to laugh. Kieran let the dead chrono sit on his wrist and counted 3 long minutes by breath because a dead thing strapped to a body still has weight, and weight can be repurposed as a tether to the present. When the sky stopped crawling, the wind sharpened. That was the plunge the instructors had promised. Minus 80 bites in a way that makes every thin place in a shelter confess itself. A lid lifted somewhere and slapped down hard. He moved toward the sound and found the shorter Ilex fighting a sail that had no mast. She had built her shelter a hand too high, proud of clean blocks and neat seams. Beauty had given the wind a handle. He dropped to his knees opposite her, shoved snow along the windward edge to bury the lip, and gestured without words for her to lower the spine. She obeyed as if obedience were natural. Together they reformed the lid closer to the body line that heat could love. She panted and said nothing because pride, his grandmother's other definition of pride, had already eaten. He touched the vent with a knuckle and felt pull. He nodded and slid away. Inside his trench, a faint sweetness had replaced the cold smell of cleaned air. The line between good heat and bad air is a line that does not announce itself with a trumpet. He lifted the lid 2 fingers and took 3 slow breaths out and 3 slow breaths in, and when the taste lightened to plain cold, he eased the lid down to a 1/4-inch gap and set a small wedge under the lee edge. He adjusted the wick to a lower, slower burn and told himself a sentence about a blue door and a brass latch, counting words without losing the hinge. The sentence held. He let his jaw unclench. He pressed his palms to his thighs to check sweat. Dry. He closed his eyes for 30 breaths and opened them again, because the kind of sleep that steals a life begins with a kind of relief that sounds exactly like victory. The flare returned twice before the sky paled. Each time, equipment that had limped hung its head and stopped pretending. The taller Ilex tapped a dead screen and then laughed at the futility with a sound that made no fun of anyone else. The Vrathi dug his claws into a block and carved a vent like an artist who had finally accepted the form. The medic moved less like a map reader and more like a listener. When dawn came, it did not arrive as light so much as a gentler indifference. The star made a smear, and the wind changed from a blade to a file. Kieran slid the lid back and let his lungs have a moment of air that did not bite as deep. Fingers still worked. Toes still reported. The can still held a small sun that had eaten only what it needed. He pinched the wick down and let the flame die with a small, reluctant sigh. He crawled out. Frost made everything crystalline, from quills to lashes. The medic's mask had 2 clear circles where warm air had kept the film from settling. The taller Ilex had a beard of rime that hid the scar so that the jaw looked gentler. The shorter Ilex moved with the careful economy of a person who had done a hard thing and did not plan to waste the having done. The Vrathi flexed his hands and looked at the quills that had rhymed along their edges. He touched one, frowned, and then shrugged a shoulder that made the quills whisper. Kieran nodded to each without ceremony. "Fuel check," he said. "We stretch fat for the next cycle. We need more wicks and more lids set lower. We move as soon as the wind gives us a corridor." The medic lifted a hand. "I felt tightness," she said, tapping her chest. "Not fear. Air." He pointed to her lid. "Your wedge was too thin. Better than starved, worse than tuned. Let's fix it before we walk. 10 minutes now saves an hour of stupid later." She nodded. The taller Ilex stepped close. "I mocked you," he said, voice plain. "I was wrong. Kieran squinted at the horizon to keep expression from becoming a conversation. "Mocking burns," he said. "You stopped burning. Good." They repaired small things with the respect small things deserve. He showed the medic how to crease the lid so that melt and refreeze would seal seams instead of widening them. He showed the shorter Ilex how to anchor a can with 3 small chips of ice pressed like teeth into the snow so that a flinch would not topple it. He walked the Vrathi through making a reflector from the silver inside a ration foil, curved around the can to push heat back into a hollow. The Vrathi's claws fumbled on the thin metal and then found a gentler grip that surprised hands built to tear. "Good," Kieran said. "Just enough curve. Not a cup, a smile." The Vrathi bared teeth in a way that could mean humor in a cold that flattened nuance. "Smile," he said, testing the human word like a pebble on the tongue. When the wind fell to the level that let a person move without wasting a day's warmth in an hour's walk, he shouldered his pack. The shorter Ilex pointed. "Ridge 2 clicks," she said. "Shadow shows a cut. Maybe a lava tube. Maybe a rock lip." The medic adjusted a strap and kept her hands inside her sleeves to hoard the new heat. "We can rebuild there," she said. The taller Ilex looked at the star and at the sastrugi and at the faint line of particles that traced a boundary between gusts. "Angle 30 south of the obvious line," he said. "The drift tells me the cut lies farther than the eye tells me." Kieran nodded. "Take 30 south," he said. "Count your steps. If you stop feeling your thumbs, tell me before your thumbs tell you." The Vrathi snorted. "I feel everything," he said. "Quills are nerves." Kieran smiled under his scarf without letting it reach his eyes. "Good. Use the ones that hurt to tell the ones that freeze what to do." They walked without waste. He set a pace that used breath like a metronome and not like a drumline. He kept his mouth closed and breathed through his nose to save moisture. He put a small square of cloth against his teeth to keep the air from making them ache from cold. When the medic stumbled on a ridge, he reached without hurry, steadied her elbow, and let go before help could become an insult. The taller Ilex checked the line every 100 steps and adjusted without comment. The shorter Ilex scanned for the kind of shadow that lies and the kind that tells the truth. The Vrathi scouted 3 body lengths ahead, claws finding purchase where boots slid. Kieran watched the way snow drifted around rocks and avoided places where a pocket of warmth had made a crust treacherous. He taught a small thing as he went, because instruction works best when the body is already tuned to learn. "Armpits," he said, holding his hands up to show the curve. "Good for fingers. Inside thighs for hands. Back of neck for cheeks. Warm the core last. Warm the working parts first." The medic nodded, storing the map. The Vrathi chuckled. "Humans and warmth," he said. "Obsession." Kieran shrugged. "Obsession is a word people use for skills that save lives too cheaply to be beautiful." The cut in the ridge was farther than the eye had allowed, exactly as the taller Ilex had read. When they reached it, the wind dropped to a murmur, and the air felt briefly thick with a kind of mercy. The lip offered a darkness that might be a tube, or might be a promise of a tube. He tested the edge with a pole and measured the echo with a hum pressed through his teeth. The echo came back close. No tube. A shallow overhang, but deep enough to wedge a line of lids under a stone that did not move. He ran his glove along the rock and felt pocks where melted snow had kissed and fled 1,000 times. Good. He marked positions with chips set like small cairns and set his team to cutting trenches that curved slightly inward to use the stone as a roof. The medic's hands did not fumble. The shorter Ilex no longer built too high. The taller Ilex cut vents with a steady rhythm, pausing to listen to the air and adjusting at once when tone shifted. The Vrathi asked for foil and produced a reflector without buckling at once. Kieran built his trench last. He had always preferred to do it in that order because it let him measure tiredness in the way his hands made shapes. When his shapes got sloppy, he knew the day had taken a bigger slice than the clock would confess. His shapes were still clean. That meant the rhythm of the night's work had given back as much as it had taken. He set his can, trimmed his wick, and waited to light until he had heard the medic's flame find the right whisper, and the ilex flames settle to the color that means fuel is being sipped and not gulped. He lit his last. The little sun answered with a sound like a match struck in a house where the power has been out for hours. He let the relief register as a breath and not as a grin, then tucked the scarf and slid in. The sky beyond the lip had softened to the gray that mistakes itself for kindness. He lay with his cheek against his sleeve and made a sentence about a kettle and a brass latch and a window that fogged and cleared. The sentence held through to the latch. He closed his eyes and let second morning begin on muscles that had learned the night's language. Somewhere beyond the rock, the wind rehearsed a new argument. He smiled once, small and private, and slept the way a person sleeps who has given others a trick that old hands taught him for the price of paying attention. The overhang became a kind of anchor, its shadow breaking the monotony of the frozen plain. By the time the second night threatened to fall, the rock's sheltering lip felt like the first truly deliberate choice the team had made together. Kieran's trench held the slow pulse of his flame without wavering, and the air inside stayed just cool enough to keep him alert without biting. He lay with one arm tucked under his head and the other resting near the can, letting the steady rhythm of the burn seep into his bones. Outside, muffled through snow and fabric, the cadence of movement reached him, shuffling boots, the occasional scrape of claw on rock, and voices pitched low. The others were moving between shelters, checking vents and lids, doing the small maintenance work without needing him to prompt. That was a shift worth noting. When he slid the lid aside and eased out, the light had already begun its long fade. The star was sinking into a haze, casting a dirty amber glow across the wind-sculpted ridges. The medic was crouched near the shorter Ilex's trench, pointing at a vent and gesturing to adjust its angle. The taller Ilex was scraping frost from the inside of his lid with deliberate, economical motions, humming a low note to himself, as if to keep pace. The Vrathi stood near the rock's edge, quills lifted to catch the faintest shifts in wind, his head tilted like a hunter listening for the first crack of prey underfoot. None of them looked as brittle as they had the day before. Kieran stepped to the medic's side, running his glove along the vent she was adjusting. "Too wide," he said, his voice steady. "You'll lose more heat than you gain airflow. Half that opening and pack the edges." She nodded without protest, already pressing small ice chips into place to narrow the gap. Her fingers moved with more precision now, no longer clumsy with cold. She glanced at him once, and in her expression there was no trace of the panic he had seen when she first called him over in the night. The Vrathi moved closer, his breath leaving faint vapor in the thinning air. "Wind shift," he said, his voice like dry reeds rubbing together. "Coming from the north now. Cold will deepen fast." Kieran studied the quills, which had begun to frost along their tips, and trusted the reading. "Then we adjust before it arrives," he said. "Seal the lee sides tighter. We'll need the flames slower tonight." The Vrathi gave a short, sharp nod and turned back to his own trench. As the wind began to crawl over the ridge in low, exploratory gusts, Kieran gathered the group for a brief check. He crouched near the rock's edge so the stone itself would break the worst of the breeze. "Tonight will be harder," he said. "The cold will push harder, and the wind will try to steal every bit of heat we've built. Keep your flames small and steady. Overburning now means no fuel later. If you feel air thinning, adjust your vent first before you panic." He looked at each in turn, making sure the words landed. The medic's jaw was set with determination. The shorter Ilex gave a tight nod. The taller Ilex tapped his pack in a gesture that meant his fuel was ready. The Vrathi stood still, his quills trembling faintly, but his eyes fixed on Kieran with a focus that carried no mockery. When they returned to their trenches, Kieran checked his own wick, trimming it to a fine point to keep the flame low. He set a reflector of folded foil behind it, angling it to bounce warmth toward his chest. The light from the flame turned the inside of the trench into a narrow world of gold and shadow. He settled in, keeping the lid a fraction open at the lee edge, just enough to feel the faint pull of air. The rock above creaked in the cold, a sound like bones shifting in their sleep. Halfway through the night, a sharp thud against the overhang snapped him awake. He froze, listening. Another thud followed, then a scraping sound as something large moved along the ridge above. He eased the lid back just enough to peer into the dimness. Shapes moved against the faint glimmer of the sky, low, heavy forms, their movements deliberate. The medic's shelter was closest to the sound, her vent glowing faintly from the steady flame inside. The creatures, if they were creatures, seemed drawn to the warmth. Kieran slid out of his trench, careful not to disturb the flame, and crossed the snow with low, measured steps. The wind had masked his movement, carrying his scent away from the ridge. When he reached the medic's trench, he tapped the lid twice in the signal they had agreed on for emergencies. She slid it open an inch, her eyes wide in the faint light. He pressed a gloved finger to his scarf, motioning for silence, then pointed upward. Her gaze flicked to the ridge, and she froze. The taller Ilex emerged next, having caught the change in movement. Without words, he angled toward the rock's edge, scanning for detail. As one of the shapes shifted, a faint glint of ice-crusted fur caught the low light. Kieran recognized the build. Moon grazers, massive herbivores that roamed the plains in slow, stubborn migrations. They were not predators, but their sheer weight could crush shelters without noticing. And they were drawn to warmth in deep cold, sometimes lying down over vented shelters for the heat, suffocating whatever was inside. He moved quickly now, circling to the Vrathi's trench. The alien was already standing, claws flexed, his quills lifting in a silent display meant to warn off intruders. Kieran shook his head once, then gestured toward the grazers and mimed a wide arc. The Vrathi's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, moving along the outer edge of the overhang to position himself where he could create a distraction if needed. With quiet efficiency, Kieran motioned for the others to lower their vents completely for a short period. It would kill the visible glow and reduce the draw of heat to the grazers. One by one, lids settled, and the faint points of light winked out. The night deepened into near-total darkness, the only illumination the weak smear of the star far off and the cold gleam of frost on rock. The grazers lingered for several minutes, shifting and snuffling along the ridge. Kieran stayed crouched, every muscle tight, listening to the deep, slow exhalations of the massive creatures. Finally, one gave a low, resonant grunt and turned away, moving back into the open plain. The others followed, their heavy bodies making the ground vibrate faintly as they passed. When the sound faded, he let out a long, silent breath. He signaled the all clear, and the vents lifted again, flames coaxed back to life in careful increments. The medic's hands trembled slightly as she relit her can, but her movements were controlled. The taller Ilex gave a brief nod in his direction, a quiet acknowledgement of quick thinking. The Vrathi muttered something in his own language, the tone low and grudging, but his quills relaxed. When Kieran returned to his trench, he noticed the air inside felt colder than before. The pause in heating had leached much of the warmth. He cupped his hands around the flame until it caught fully again, then lowered the lid and let the steady draw re-establish itself. His body ached from the crouching and the tension, but he pushed it aside. The grazers were gone, and the shelters were intact. That was enough for now. By the time the first pale hint of morning brushed the horizon, the wind had stilled to a cautious whisper. The cold was sharper, denser, but the group was still whole, their shelters standing, their fuel reserves intact. As the others emerged one by one, Kieran took a moment to look at them, faces still rimed with frost, eyes shadowed from too little sleep, but each moving with a quiet competence that had not been there before. The medic adjusted her gear without fumbling. The Ilex siblings exchanged a few low words about vent angles. The Vrathi tilted his head toward Kieran in a gesture that might have been respect. The night's test had been different from the first. Less about personal endurance and more about watching, anticipating, and keeping the group alive as a whole. Kieran felt the weight of that shift settle in his chest, solid and steady. Without speaking, he began to gather his things, knowing the day ahead would demand even more. The others followed suit, their movements no longer scattered but aligned, like parts of a single, deliberate machine. In the silence of the frozen morning, that felt like the rarest victory of all. The fourth morning came with a light so pale it barely distinguished itself from the night. A gray veil stretched across the frozen plain. Kieran stepped out from under the rock's overhang, his boots crunching in a rhythm that told him the crust had thickened overnight. The air had a new quality, still and brittle, as though the wind had retreated to prepare something worse. He scanned the horizon, squinting against the weak light. To the south, low clouds clung to the surface like smoke, moving in slow coils that betrayed a weather shift. The taller Ilex emerged from his shelter with a measured step, his eyes following Kieran's line of sight. "That is not cloud," the Ilex said quietly. "It is frost smoke. Temperature drop will be sharp. Air will be too heavy for long walks." Kieran gave a short nod, already adjusting his mental plan. He had wanted to move further along the ridge to scout for better terrain, but the change in air density would sap energy faster than the team could replace it. Staying put was safer, if they prepared for the worst cold yet. The medic joined them, her mask pulled tight against her face. She rubbed her hands together inside her sleeves, conserving warmth as she spoke. "Fuel is low," she said. "Enough for one full night if we burn as before, not enough for two." Kieran studied her eyes, noting the absence of panic. She was simply reporting a fact, ready to adapt. He motioned for everyone to gather, and soon the shorter Ilex and the Vrathi stood with them, the group forming a rough half-circle in the lee of the rock. "The cold ahead will be harder than before," Kieran said, his voice carrying just enough weight to cut through the thin air. "We cut the burn rate in half. Flames must be small, just enough to keep the air moving and take the edge off the cold. No more. We layer everything we have, and we prepare the shelters to hold warmth better than last night." He looked to each face until he saw understanding. No one argued. They began reinforcing their trenches. Kieran taught the shorter Ilex how to create a double lid by layering a thin sheet of emergency fabric beneath the snow blocks, trapping air between them for insulation. He showed the medic how to line the inside of her trench with flattened ration packaging, the reflective foil pushing heat back toward her body. The Vrathi, claws deft despite their bulk, carved small niches in the snow walls for the cans, positioning them at the level where heat would rise directly into the breathing zone without wasting fuel on empty space. The taller Ilex experimented with vent placement, creating an angled channel that let in enough air to keep the flame alive while forcing cold drafts to sink before they reached the occupant. Every modification was a gamble against the cold's persistence, but each one added a fraction of advantage. By midday, the frost smoke had thickened, the horizon blurring into the ground until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Kieran could feel the weight of the air in his chest, each breath slightly slower to satisfy. Movement became deliberate. Even small tasks, carving a vent, pressing snow into gaps, required measured effort. He paced himself, making sure no one lingered too long outside their shelter without reason. He kept a close watch on fingers and faces, noting when the medic's gloves stiffened or when the Vrathi's quills began to frost too quickly. When he saw the shorter Ilex pausing with her hands exposed, adjusting a block without protection, he crossed the snow in 3 strides and covered her hands with his own gloved grip, pressing them against his chest until sensation returned. She muttered thanks, but he waved it off, pointing her back toward her trench. As the light began its long descent toward evening, the air temperature dropped with a suddenness that even Kieran, accustomed to cold, felt like a blow. The frost smoke closed in, muffling sound, shrinking the world to the space between the rock and the edge of the nearest shelter. He knew that this kind of cold could slip past every barrier if vigilance faltered. He double-checked his own trench, tightening the lid so only a thin, deliberate wedge allowed airflow. He shortened his wick until the flame was no more than a steady ember, the heat gentle but constant. The reflective foil did the rest, spreading warmth evenly in the confined space. He tested the air, still breathable, still moving, and settled in to wait. The night deepened fast, the temperature outside plummeting into numbers that mattered less than the feeling they carried. A weight that slowed blood, a pressure that made even thought move sluggishly. Inside his trench, Kieran stayed alert by cycling through mental tasks, recalling maps, running through survival sequences in his head, even counting the heartbeats between each shift of the wind. Periodically, he lifted the lid a fraction to listen. Each time, he heard nothing but the faint rasp of frost crystals falling from the rock above, the quietest reminder that the world outside was still moving. At some point, a low sound broke the stillness, a groan, muffled and drawn out. It came from the medic's direction. Kieran slid from his shelter, his movements precise to avoid spilling heat. The frost smoke caught in his scarf as he crossed the short distance. He tapped the medic's lid, receiving no response. Pulling it back, he found her curled tight, her eyes half closed, her breath shallow. Her flame was low, almost extinguished, the wick charred too short to feed. He acted quickly, trimming the end with his multi-tool, feeding it the smallest piece of cloth coated with ration fat. The flame revived in a hesitant flicker, then steadied. He massaged her hands through her gloves, speaking in a steady tone until her eyes focused. "Stay awake," he told her. "Count with me if you have to." She nodded weakly, murmuring numbers as he sealed the lid again, leaving her vent slightly wider for a few minutes to clear the heavy air. When he returned to his trench, he noticed the taller Ilex crouched outside his own shelter, his breath coming fast. "Vent iced over," the Ilex said through clenched teeth. Kieran took the awl from his multi-tool and cleared the crust in quick, sharp motions, the ice breaking in thin shards. "Check it every hour," he said. "If it closes again, open it before you feel the air change. Do not wait for the flame to falter." The Ilex gave a short nod, already ducking back inside. The rest of the night passed in fragments, short bursts of rest interrupted by careful checks on each shelter. He found the Vrathi awake both times he checked, sitting in his trench with his claws resting on his knees, quills faintly swaying. "Quills tell me if air goes bad," the Vrathi explained once, his voice low. "Easier than checking vent." Kieran gave a small, approving nod. Any method that worked was worth keeping. By the time the pale light of morning seeped into the frost smoke, the cold had lost some of its sharpest edge, though it remained far from forgiving. Kieran emerged, stamping his feet to push warmth back into his toes. One by one, the others came out, tired, frost-marked, but standing. The medic managed a faint smile. The taller Ilex gave a short, satisfied grunt. The Vrathi tilted his head toward Kieran in a gesture that needed no translation. They had endured the cold's most punishing test yet, not because of technology or strength alone, but because each had learned to read the cold the way one reads a living thing, watching for its habits, anticipating its moves, and refusing to give it any more than it could take. Kieran looked toward the horizon, where the frost smoke was beginning to thin, revealing the hard clarity of the plain beyond. The storm's worst had passed, but the mission was not over. He adjusted his scarf, checked the weight of his pack, and turned back to the group. "We move at first windbreak," he said. "The ridge ahead might give us better ground. We'll keep the same pace as yesterday. No risks, no wasted motion." No one disagreed. In the stillness that followed, he felt the quiet strength that comes from a group no longer holding together out of necessity alone, but because they had learned, through cold, fear, and long hours in the dark, how to survive as more than individuals. The fifth morning began with a rare stillness, the kind of pause the land gives before deciding whether to relent or strike again. The frost smoke had thinned during the night, and now the plain stretched out in a wide sweep of pale light. The wind was faint but restless, moving in short, uncertain bursts, as if testing the air before committing to direction. Kieran stood on the edge of the overhang, scanning the ridge to the east. In the distance, the land dipped into a narrow cut, the shadow there darker than the surrounding plain. It could be a passage, or it could be a trap. He weighed the risk against the certainty of dwindling fuel. The others stirred behind him, each moving with the deliberate precision that came from conserving strength. The medic was first to approach, adjusting her mask and keeping her hands inside her sleeves until the last moment. "It looks farther than it is," she said quietly, following his gaze. "The air is clear, but the cold is still heavy. If we move, we must commit." He nodded, not looking away from the cut. "We will move. The ridge might shield us, and if there is any shelter in that shadow, it will be better than staying here with the fuel almost gone." The taller Ilex joined them, his breath slow, eyes narrowing as he studied the horizon. "Wind will rise in 2 hours," he said. "We can reach the cut in 1 if we do not stop." The Vrathi emerged next, his quills lightly dusted with frost, but standing at a sharper angle than usual. "I smell stone," the Vrathi said. "Not far. Stone means pockets." The shorter Ilex came last, fastening the strap on her pack and glancing between the group and the ridge ahead. No one argued. That was the first silent agreement of the day. They moved out in a staggered line, Kieran at the front to set the pace. The medic followed close behind, her steps measured to match his rhythm. The taller Ilex stayed to the right, scanning the land ahead for dips and shadows that might hide hazards. The Vrathi took the far left, his claws finding purchase where boots slipped. The shorter Ilex brought up the rear, turning her head often to check the line of the plain behind them. The cold was sharp, but the clarity of the air gave every sound a distinct edge. The crunch of boots, the faint hiss of frost breaking underfoot, the occasional creak of pack straps tightening under the cold's pull. As they drew closer to the ridge, the cut revealed more detail. The shadow was not from a cliff, but from a narrow canyon, its mouth partially blocked by fallen rock. Wind curled around the stone, making a low hum that echoed against the canyon walls. Kieran slowed, motioning for the others to hold position. He moved ahead alone, testing the surface of the snow near the entrance. It was crusted over, but not hollow. There was no risk of breaking through into a hidden pit. He stepped inside, the stone walls immediately muting the wind. The air here felt different, not warm, but less stripped. He took a few more steps until the canyon curved sharply to the left, blocking the view from outside. Beyond the curve, the walls widened slightly, revealing a space sheltered on 3 sides and roofed by an overhang of rock and ice. It was not a deep cave, but it was enough to break the wind entirely. He returned to the entrance and motioned the others forward. The medic's eyes flicked to the stone walls with quiet relief. The taller Ilex tilted his head back to study the ice formations overhead. The Vrathi's quills lowered slightly, sensing the drop in wind pressure. The shorter Ilex stepped past Kieran into the sheltered space, exhaling slowly, as if she had been holding her breath since leaving the overhang. "This will do," Kieran said, his voice firm. "We will not waste time building full trenches here. We use the rock as the windbreak and dig shallow pits for the cans. Enough to hold heat low without losing it to the air above." They worked quickly, each choosing a spot against the inner wall. Kieran's was near the left corner, where the rock angled inward, creating a natural pocket. He cleared the snow down to hardpack and set his can at the center. The medic lined her space with foil from ration packs before setting her wick, making a smooth, reflective surface to trap heat. The taller Ilex carved a shallow recess in the wall behind his spot, angling it so the heat from his can would bounce forward. The Vrathi pressed his claws into the snow to shape a narrow channel around his can, guiding airflow toward it. The shorter ilex packed snow tight around her position, leaving only the smallest vent at the side. By the time the first hints of wind returned, each flame was lit and steady, the orange glow flickering against the rock walls. The cold still pressed in, but without the constant pull of wind, it no longer stole warmth as quickly. Kieran sat with his back against the wall, hands cupped near the can. The heat was modest, but in this confined space, it felt more substantial than it had in the open. He glanced around at the others, faces pale and drawn, but no longer pinched with the tightness that came from bracing against gusts. Even the Vrathi's posture had shifted, the rigid angle of his shoulders relaxing slightly. As night fell, the canyon's silence deepened. Outside, the wind rose to a steady moan, but it only reached them as a muted whisper. Kieran kept his flame low, the fuel burning slowly. His mind drifted to his grandmother's kitchen again, the way the candlelight had turned walls into something softer, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and wool drying by the stove. Here, the scent was metal and ice, but the principle was the same. Heat made a space into a place. At some point in the night, the medic stirred and murmured something about the fuel. Kieran checked her can, finding it still strong but with the wick beginning to shorten. He trimmed it slightly, careful not to waste any length, and set it back in place. She gave a quiet nod and settled again without another word. The taller ilex remained awake for much of the night, occasionally adjusting his vent angle. The Vrathi dozed with his head tilted forward, quills barely swaying. The shorter ilex slept with one hand over her can, as if guarding it from being taken. When the pale light of morning touched the canyon walls, it brought with it a shift in the wind's tone. The storm outside had begun to break. Kieran stood and stepped to the entrance, the air biting but less aggressive than before. The plain stretched wide and open again, the frost smoke gone, leaving a horizon sharp enough to cut the sky. The mission's clock was nearly run down. The pickup would arrive before the next nightfall. He turned back to the group. "We have done what we came to do," he said. "We survived every night. We adapted. When the shuttle arrives, the instructors will see that." The medic smiled faintly. The taller ilex gave a single, deliberate nod. The Vrathi clicked his claws once in acknowledgement. The shorter ilex's eyes held a glint of pride she did not try to hide. When the sound of the shuttle's engines reached the canyon, it carried none of the tension it had when they were first dropped. They stepped out together into the cold light, their movements steady, their lines straight. The wind no longer felt like an enemy, only a fact of the place, something to be read and answered. As the shuttle door lowered, Kieran glanced once at the plane, then at the rock that had sheltered them through the last night. His grandmother's voice came back to him, not as memory but as certainty. High-tech fails. Good tricks last forever. He tightened his scarf and stepped aboard, the warmth inside the shuttle almost startling in its softness, but not more welcome than the knowledge that he could leave this place and know exactly how he would survive if he ever returned.